worst part about being a scapegoat to a narcissistic abuser. I recently saw the comic Bill Burr perform prior to Omicron, and he talked about his experience of being on the psychedelic mushrooms with some of his friends and wife. Now, if you know much about him, he alludes to growing up in a family where yelling and unpredictable outbursts of rage were just part of the day-to-day with his father. And I don't know if either of his parents were narcissistic or not, but the experience he described while on mushrooms I really think highlights the worst part about being the scapegoat to a narcissistically abusive parent. He basically talked about how when the mushrooms hit him, he went into a place that felt very dark, and that nothing he thought nor said to himself could change that feeling. It just was. He went to his room in order not to rain on his friend's parade, and the feeling still didn't change. He went to hold his wife's hand as she came in to join him in the bedroom, and that didn't comfort him either. He explained that he felt lonely and unloved, and finally stopped trying to fight it. And that's when he realized that this was exactly how he felt throughout his whole childhood. What really stood out to me about this part of his act was how he described the experience of there being someone there, but that connecting to them provided him with no comfort. Like when he went to hold his wife's hand and could feel nothing in doing so. That experience, I think, gets to the heart of the trauma faced by the scapegoat of a narcissistically abusive parent. The child learns deep down that although he has a parent there, going to that parent will offer him no felt comfort, protection, or sense of safety. So the child's catastrophically alone in that he is around people in a physical sense, but cannot feel any sense of inner connection to them. So he has to suffer this aloneness in the privacy of his own being, just as Bill Burr was on his mushroom trip. In today's video, I'm going to explain why the scapegoated child of the narcissistic parent often endures this trauma of having nobody who can help him feel better inside. Next, I want to offer some thoughts about what to do when or if this state arises for you in the process of recovering from narcissistic abuse. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I specialize in helping individuals recover from narcissistic abuse in individual therapy and through my online course and accompanying Facebook community. We take a three-step approach to recovery. First involves making sense of what happened so that you know you didn't deserve the narcissistic abuse. Second is gaining distance, whether it's psychological, emotional, and/or physical, from the narcissistic abuse. And third is learning to live in defiance of the narcissist's rules. Today's video sits squarely in the making sense of what happened department. If you're interested in another resource on making sense of what happened, I'd encourage you to check out my free ebook on surviving narcissistic abuse as the scapegoated survivor. You can find the link in the description below, or you can click here. And finally, if you haven't already, I'd encourage you to subscribe to this channel so that you get alerted every time a new video gets posted. So why does a scapegoated child often feel lonely and unloved, and that there's nothing that can be done about it? Well, let's quickly review the psychological dynamics in play when a narcissistic parent identifies a child to play the role of scapegoat. Scapegoat just means the person on whom all of the narcissist's problems are blamed. And as I've said a lot on these videos, the narcissist starts with a core sense of worthlessness that he or she can't bear to acknowledge. So they then have to relegate that sense of worthlessness to their unconsciousness. Next, the narcissist works, again unconsciously, to discover this worthlessness in someone else. And that someone else is usually someone over whom they have authority, or where there's a power imbalance in relationship that favors the narcissist. And third, the narcissist then acts in ways to coercively influence the other person to identify with this cast-off sense of worthlessness. So the narcissistic abuser may overtly or covertly undermine, criticize, invalidate, deride, or otherwise hurt the other person, but in a way that's designed to get that person to believe that they deserve to be treated this way, that it's the other person's flawedness that makes it necessary for the narcissist to treat them this way. And when I described this process, I realized recently that I'd done so with an emphasis on the dynamics at play, but I want to focus today on the consequences to the inner experience of the child being cast into the role of scapegoat in this manner. I mean, sure, there's the onslaught of negative feelings and beliefs about oneself that must be contended with by the scapegoated child. But if we zoom out for a second, a child has the inborn need to have an adult to turn to, with his or her emotional needs, their triumphs, their pains, etc. And the child is programmed to expect protection, guidance, celebration, connection when they do this. But then if the child has the misfortune of being born to a narcissistic parent, and then the further misfortune of being thrust into the role of scapegoat, then all those inborn needs are at the risk of going completely unmet. So the child's being blamed, scolded, and devalued where he or she's hoping to find love, understanding, and compassion. Now I think that child is likely to learn that getting closer to the narcissistic parent brings him or her no comfort or reassurance. But rather the child learns that he's very much on his own in his life, and he must find a way to manage the accompanying panic, terror, anger, and despair that this cruel fact could evoke in him. And of course, I don't mean that the young child has conscious thoughts along these lines. I'm trying to describe how the child can learn that he faces this sort of endless, permanent state of being lonely and unloved, as Bill Burr put it, from which there's no rescue. There is a person there, the narcissistic parent, whom the child looks to be the source who could rescue them from this state of utter aloneness. But the child instead feels that utter absence of love, kindness, and care that they want to find in their parent. It may be obvious, but just to say, the narcissistic parent cannot also offer kindness, respect, care, and curiosity while they're using the scapegoated child to rid themselves of a feeling, that worthlessness, which they can't tolerate. And then the child has to bear the cost of the parent putting his or her own psychological pathology before the child. I think that the narcissistic parent's structural lack of feeling empathy for others helps them do this without concern for the emotional consequences to the child. And I also think that this is sensed by the child, and that it's part of what seals the child's fate. That the child knows that appealing to the narcissistic parent's concern for the child's emotional well-being will do the child no good. That the parent will be unaffected by such appeals. So instead, the child is faced again with this experience of the parent sort of standing there, but no connection coming from the parent towards the child. Frankly, that's a horrifying reality to cope with at a time in life when the child does not yet have the inner resources necessary to cope with something like that. The child can't say, whoa, what's my parent's problem? I'm out of here. I'm going to go where I'm wanted. I mean, if the child could, then the situation wouldn't be as traumatic as it is. Instead, the child must stay trying to eke out some form of connection in spite of the hopelessness felt about ever getting it from the parent. I talk a lot more in depth about this situation in my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse, and specifically in Module 2 on how narcissistic abuse impacts the survivor's psychology, and specifically how the child has to relegate the awareness of this state of being alone and unloved to their unconscious and develop what's called a hopeful self that seeks relationship with the same parent who is unable or unwilling to offer them the love they need and deserve. Well, now I'd like to talk about coping with the hopelessness that can be felt by the scapegoated child who's felt alone and unloved without a solution. I mean, there's a profound dashing of hopes for the child who suffers narcissistic abuse from a parent. As I mentioned, the child's biologically programmed to be hopeful that his parent will provide him what he needs to feel securely attached, know that he's loved for the separate person he is, and know that the love he has to offer is valuable to that parent. And I think, unfortunately, all three of these hopes don't get to be realized by the child of the narcissistic parent. And as a result, the child faces a pretty hopeless situation. And the feeling that can accompany that hopelessness is often despair. So the scapegoated child of a narcissistic parent may be very accustomed to an inner and often very private sense of despair at this felt hopelessness of there ever being anyone out there who can offer them the sense of connection that they're seeking. So this post-traumatic sense of hopelessness experienced in relationship to the narcissistic parent can interfere with entertaining new hope that connections with people in one's life might actually be felt within. And I think that one of the tasks in recovery from such trauma involves integrating what you've been through with what might now be possible. There's no denying, I think really only accepting what one faced at the hands of the narcissistic parent. And it can be in the case of accepting this that the notion of hope can reemerge and maybe be tolerated by the scapegoat survivor. And I think it can be important to do this while in a form of therapy, because therapy offers a specific kind of relationship that allows you to describe what you've been through and what you suffered while being compassionately understood and validated. And you get to work with your therapist to understand how the past hopelessness might be getting in the way of finding connection that feels good in your current relationships. You know, the initial problem was the lack of connection offered by the narcissistic parent. So I think it can be important to successfully come to terms with this type of experience while being with somebody who can offer that type of connection. In my experience, that's been very antidotal to this initial trauma of being and feeling alone and unloved. You know, recovery might be thought of as witnessing the dead ends of the maze that you were in during the abuse, but this time from a vantage point outside of the maze and while being in connection to someone new and safe, like in this case, the therapist. And I think that can very much help one differentiate what one faced then with what one can have now. That in effect, the task today is not to find one's way out of the maze, but to actually know or maybe discover that you're no longer in it. And the connection with someone else as you're doing that can be really, really important. Well, I hope today's video might shed some light on a feature of the experience of the scapegoated child of the narcissistically abusive parent. You know, I think it's a feature that is often wordless, but that is also one of, if not the most painful aspects of having to endure this form of abuse as a child. Well, thanks for watching today, and again, thank you for your engagement with the channel. I'll see you next Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time.